Hey all, today we're talking about object-oriented programming in Python. Now, something that may have been mentioned in previous materials or that you might understand from working in other object-oriented programming language is that everything that we encounter in Python is an object. And to define exactly what an object is, at least in a programming sense, we say the object-oriented program is a paradigm in which everything is based on these objects, where data structures that contain data, um, they contain the data in the form of fields, or more formally, we might call these attributes of a specific data type. And they also typically have a set of functions or functionality that they can do. And when we're referring to those in terms of a specific type of object, a specific data type, those are called methods. And these objects, with their attributes and methods, really define everything that we do while we're programming in Python. For example, it's likely that you've encountered the common data type of string and used some of the string methods like lower, which converts everything to lowercase. Upper does the opposite. Sorted, or the dot sort method, where we can actually sort the objects in a list. And each of those is a function or a method where our data type can actually complete something. Now, talking about objects a little bit more specifically, what we're referring to exactly are classes, right? String is a class, integer is a class, and most of the data types and objects that we're going to be dealing with as data scientists are classes. And you can think of a class as a way of abstracting a specific data type. And when we're talking about abstraction, we're talking about the quality of dealing with ideas rather than events. And how this relates to programming is a class represents a blueprint of sorts for a specific data type. It outlines what attributes that data type can or must have. It also outlines the types of methods that are associated with that data type. So when we're talking about classes from an abstracted point of view, we're talking about these data types sort of generally. We're not talking about a specific instance of this data type that has actual values in each of the fields or attributes and has actual methods defined, but rather we're saying that when we're talking about the class, it's that blueprint. It doesn't represent any specific instance or application of the data type. Now, classes also help us implement, well, I guess before we move on, there are a few things and a few reasons why it makes a lot of sense to start to define different objects and generalize how those objects work exactly, because it makes it so we can group together very similar things and have something that represents them generally, sort of like that template or that blueprint for different objects, which is reusable, right? And that reusability is really one of the most important things that we gain from classes. The other thing about classes is that when a user is trying to do something with a certain data type or a certain class object, that they don't necessarily need to understand how or why all of the things work. What you're able to do is, if you're dealing with a string, right, you're able to use the length method to determine how many objects are in that string, how many characters are in that string specifically. And we don't need to know how the length method works. We just need to know that it does work and how we implement it in terms of how we can invoke that method in terms of syntax, as well as the parameters necessary for the invocation of that particular method. Um, The same thing with attributes, right? Where a list will have an attribute, which is length again, right? We don't need to know how that length is calculated. We just know that it's an attribute that we can get to from that particular object. So again, when we're talking about classes, when we're talking about objects, and we're starting to move to an object-oriented paradigm, we're going to treat everything as objects, and we have an ability where we can abstract these classes or these data types and describe objects sort of generally, and we can interact and use these objects without having to exactly know all of the underlying ways that they work or the underlying code implementations. So that's a brief introduction on object-oriented programming and classes, and you can move on to the next video, and we're going to talk about classes and object-oriented programming with just a little bit more depth.